hope, but I'm sure that we will overcome this and we'll try something new, and we'll continue this fight.
Just earlier you said there haven't been any protests, at least not yet. Are you expecting there to be protests?
To tell the truth, it's quite hard to expect a protest because the members of Navalny team are not probably willing to inspire some protests, knowing how dangerous it can be for anyone in Russia, especially because all organizations, anything connected with Alexei Navalny is now labeled as extremists in Russia. So people are not only risking or being put in detention for a couple of days, they're risking really long prison terms.
Maria Malasheva, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, Bill Browder is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. He was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005. After his lawyer Sergei Magnitsky died in a Russian prison, he became a campaigner against corruption and human rights abuses in Russia. I asked him what he had thought when he listened to Yulia's statement this morning.
Well, if Putin thought he was getting rid of a potential rival, I think he was shocked that he didn't do so at all. The Navalny family is a political family. His wife is equally impressive, and she's still alive, and she's defiant, and she's going to carry on the fight. And I think Putin really miscalculated by killing Alexei Navalny.
She has said that President Putin killed him. Do you have any doubt about that? And the reason I ask is, given the timing so close to an election, what's in it for him?
By killing Alexei Navalny, it accomplishes two goals. It takes away one of his most important critics, and who is, by the way, criticizing Putin from jail, but it also sends a very strong message to everybody else in Russia that if you think about political opposition, you'll be killed, and that will have a very profound effect on anybody who thinks about running against Putin.
Do you think President Putin directed the killing, or do you think that this was somebody who was out of control and it'll be covered up?
Putin absolutely directed this killing. Nobody would have the guts to kill Alexei Navalny unless it was Putin approved and Putin ordered. This would not have happened under any other circumstances.
So how do you see this playing out at the moment? Is he still going to be in power in a year, in 5 years?
Well, there's two possible scenarios. There is the Kim Jong-un scenario, which is that he's in power for the rest of his life. And then there is the Yanukovych. He was the head of Ukraine when the whole thing came undone and he had to flee to Russia. There's any different scenario can play itself out, and he doesn't know how it's going to play itself out. And this act of desperation of killing Alexei Navalny shows that he's scared, that he thinks that the only thing he has left is absolute hardcore repression, which is not a very stable situation for a dictator.
How do you think the West should respond to this?
I think the West can do a number of things. First and foremost, the U.S. Congress can release the $63 billion of military aid for Ukraine, which has been held up by some pro-Putin congressmen on the Republican side. I think that Britain, the United States, the EU can confiscate the $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank reserves and hand that over to Ukraine for their defense and reconstruction. And I think the West needs to take responsibility for the remaining political prisoners in Russia.
You've been in this situation before with your lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. When you learnt of Navalny's death, how did you feel? How did you react?
Well, it brought back every terrible feeling of hopelessness and horribleness that I had when Sergei was killed. It was an exactly comparable scenario. Sergei was arrested and put in jail for uncovering and exposing corruption. He was mistreated in jail. He was then killed in jail, and then the Russian government embarked on a massive cover-up. The same exact thing is happening with Alexei Navalny today. It was like a punch to the gut, and I'm still trying to process what it means that Alexei Navalny is not here. He was just such a larger-than-life, defiant, brave character, and the fact that they killed him is hard to process, hard to comprehend.
Now, you have obviously been campaigning for years for the West to do more, via not least the Magnitsky sanctions. There are some who are saying, look, it just doesn't go far enough. There isn't enough pain being felt by those responsible. Could there be much more that could be done that would make much more of a difference?
Well, the only other thing that's left in the arsenal is cutting off Russia's supplying oil to the rest of the world. So if you look at why have sanctions not stopped the war, it's because Putin can still afford the war. Why can he still afford the war? Because he gets money from the sale of oil. And the one thing that we have not done, we've done everything else. We took some very tough measures, but as long as he gets money from selling oil to China and India and places like that, he can continue to buy weapons. He can continue to spend a huge proportion of his government budget on war. And we haven't had the stomach to do that. You're saying
how can we do that? I mean, he has the support of China and India. Why would the US, the UK, and how could they stop it?
We could say to every insurance company in the world that you'll be subject to sanctions if you insure any ship that moves Russian oil. We could then say the same thing to any port that docks a ship that has or has had Russian oil. Once these sanctions are in place, will be sanctioned. We could also go after the oil refineries and the buyers of the oil in India and China. None of them want to be on the sanctions list. We have the tools. It just requires some muscular foreign policy and some unified foreign policy from the West. But we have chosen not to on the oil front because there are other issues. There's the price of oil. There's inflation, and everybody's afraid to rock that boat. And so, as long as that continues, then we're in this terrible situation where Russia gets money from China and India to wage the war, and then we're forced to give money to Ukraine to fight back. And that's kind of an irrational situation to be in.
It may be irrational, but can you really see a situation where that would happen, where China and India would be penalized by the US?
Yeah, we've seen it on a smaller scale. There are certain enterprises in China that have been subject to sanctions. The Indians only will buy oil in rupees because they're afraid of being subject to sanctions. I mean, sanctions are a very powerful tool if you use them in an intelligent way. And so it's an absolute plausible scenario. It just requires proper policy and robust policy.
Bill Browder talking to me a short time ago. To get in touch with us on social media, the hashtag BBCWATO. Our email address is world@bbc.co.uk. The reverberations of the Post Office scandal are continuing to make waves at Westminster today. The chairman of the Post Office, Henry Staunton, who was sacked last month after just over a year in the job, set out an excoriating version of events in the Sunday Times yesterday, claiming that he was being made the fall guy. It prompted the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, to say he was making it all up, and she's promised more details in a common statement later today. In yesterday's article, Henry Staunton said that Kemi Badenoch had called him last month to confirm the government was sacking him. A colleague has voiced some of his claims.
Well, someone's got to take the rap for this.
And according to him, he then replied,
Fine, we're turning the business round. We've got a strategy to move forward. The culture's dire in terms of how the postmasters are perceived in particular, but you've clearly made your decision.
He also described an episode that had taken place during his time at the post office.
Early on, I was told by a fairly senior person to stall on spending on compensation and on the replacement of Horizon, and to limp, in quotation marks, I did a file note on it, limp into the election. It was not an anti-postmaster thing, it was just straight financials. I didn't ask because I said, I'm having no part of it. I'm not here to limp into the election. It's not the right thing to do by postmasters.
Well, those claims prompted a furious response from the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, who tweeted a thread on X yesterday. We've voiced it also by a colleague.
The Henry Staunton Sunday Times interview is a disgraceful misrepresentation of my conversation with him and the reasons for his dismissal. This was all explained to the journalists who chose to ignore the facts and run with Staunton's words. Far from taking the rap, I dismissed Staunton due to very serious allegations about his conduct while chair of the Post Office, including blocking an investigation into that conduct. My department is responsible for whistleblowers, and I wouldn't ignore the allegations. The details will emerge soon enough, as I won't let the matter rest here. but will be discussing with government lawyers. Henry Staunton had a lack of grip getting justice for postmasters. The serious concerns over his conduct were the reasons I asked him to step down. That he chose to run to the media with made-up anecdotes and a series of falsehoods confirms I made the correct decision.
The Sunday Times, who conducted the interview, say they stand by their reporting. In June of last year, Henry Staunton told the House of Commons Business and Trade Select Committee about the scale of the task facing the Post Office.
I think that dealing with the past wrongs at the Post Office and postmasters has got to be the first thing. Getting a better deal for postmasters at the moment is important, and the Horizon scandal is the third challenge. So I think the challenges facing this business are as great as I've seen in any business, because not only do we have a really difficult trading situation, we've got all these separate challenges to deal with too. So I think we as a board will have our hands full going forward.
Well, the Labour MP Liam Byrne chairs the Business and Trade Select Committee, although he took up that role after Henry Staunton's appearance last year. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What is it that you would like to know, having heard what you've heard over the last 24 hours?
Well, the truth is, what I would like to know is when the sub-postmasters are going to finally get paid, because what, frankly, we could all do without right now is a kind of blame game between the Secretary of State and the former chairman. We don't need a war of words. What we really need are checks in the post to those who need redress. It's just worth, I think, taking a step back and remembering that of that 555 group, of which Mr. Bates was the key leader, only 5% have had their claims fully and finally settled, and of those convicted, only 4% have had full and finally settled. So actually what we really need now from the government is a plan to get the checks in the post, and that's why we're convening hearings at the Business and Trade Committee next week with Mr. Bates, with the Chief Executive of the Post Office, Mr. Reid, and I have this morning invited Mr. Staunton to come and join us in the House of Commons as well.
Okay, so you're asking him to come back to set out well, I suppose what's happened to him, or his knowledge of...
Yes, we've got to get to the bottom of which senior official which senior official told him to go slow on the payments, because we've got to remember that the government is bringing forward a bill which is going to overturn the convictions, and I want to use that bill to hardwire into our legislation a fixed timetable for actually getting all of the compensation payments sorted.
Do you accept that claim? You accept that claim from him that he was told that to go slow on the payments? Because obviously the business secretary is challenging that.
Well, we have obviously as a committee got the power to put people on oath. Some people next week could find themselves on oath, and we will get to the bottom of the truth. But the key thing, as I say, we've got to understand what's going on, because we've got to make sure that Parliament uses the bill that's coming to us to put once and for all a hard timetable on getting justice and redress for those that were wronged.
We are expecting a statement later today which may have more information about the actual process of when he was sacked and what was said. But what we do know, not least because Kemi Badenoch has tweeted it yesterday with her furious reaction, is the appointment letter for Henry Staunton, which does set out what he should be focusing on, and that includes the line, engaging positively with the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry and implementing change, including resolving issues.
I think both you and I would agree that that is a pretty high level and fairly vague instruction to deliver. And we've got to remember here that both things could be true. It could well be true that the Secretary of State did dismiss Mr. Staunton for the reasons that she set out, but it could also be true that a senior civil servant, so something different to the Secretary of State, told Mr. Staunton to soft pedal on the payments because they were worried about the Department for Business and Trade's budget, which is not in good shape. So we have, as I say, we've got to get to the bottom of the truth, but the reason for doing that is that the public's got a right to know, but crucially, there are some people here who deserve justice, and they cannot be allowed to wait any longer.
Liam Byrne, thank you very much. Israel has said it will launch a ground offensive on the city of Rafah in 3 weeks unless Hamas releases all the hostages it is holding. More than 1.5 million Palestinians are currently living in the southern city, many of them displaced from other areas of Gaza. Benny Gantz, who is a minister in the War Cabinet, announced on Sunday the military's intentions during a conference of American Jewish leaders in Jerusalem.
The world must know, and Hamas leaders must know, if by Ramadan hostages are not home, the fighting will continue everywhere to include Rafah area. We will do so in coordinated manner, facilitating the evacuation of civilians in dialogue with American and Egyptian partners and to minimize the civilian casualties as much as possible.
That leaves only 3 weeks for Israel to come up with an evacuation plan for the 1.5 million Palestinians currently in southern Gaza. Now, there's been some suggestion that people could move north or west or across the border to Egypt, and there have been satellite images published just in the last few days that appear to show the building of a wall, an enclosure across the border in Egypt, although Egypt has so far denied that. Justin Crump is chief executive of the defence and intelligence company Sibylline and joins us. Good afternoon.
Hello, sir.
What can you tell us? What can we know about what is being built across the border in Egypt?
Well, as you described, I mean, what is going up is a very high concrete wall. Areas being cleared west of the existing border with Gaza, which in itself is an enormous concrete structure covered in barbed wire, very reinforced. So this is being built some way back from that. Other areas are being cleared. It's been forced into that area by the Israeli military operation, almost like a hydraulic ram going down the strip, building the pressure. They don't want that spilling over into Egypt. They argue they don't want the Palestinians to lose their land. They think they'll never get to return. Saudi Arabia very, very strongly agrees with that. The Palestinians must stay in Gaza. But also, particularly for Egypt, they do not want 1.5 million, 2 million Palestinians displaced onto them, first of all because the problem it poses just in terms of refugees, but in the longer term these are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a problem for Egypt, and they have the example of Jordan where people were forced out and never returned. They weren't able to return, and so Egypt has this dual purpose in this, I think, to try and keep the Palestinians in, to stage aid, and also just to make sure that they don't spill out, even if they breach the first border wall and they can't carry on moving into Egypt so they can contain the problem.
What responsibility does Israel have here to rehouse people?
I mean, that's something the Israelis would argue, and they've said we'll engage in dialogue. I mean, ultimately Israel would say that they consider they have the right to continue military operations till the hostages are released and Hamas is destroyed and they've achieved their war aims. Now, the world may disagree. The world would have a program of that. But of course, at the moment, that's Israel's stance. They have a right to protect themselves. They have a right to have their people returned. They've given 3 weeks warning. They argue throughout that they've given sufficient warning and care to civilians. And again, the world may well disagree with that comment, given the scale of operations. But Israel so far has sort of always pretty much said we're doing what we can do, and it's everyone else's problem slightly. Obviously, this is reaching a very acute point here, but they will also say, well, Egypt, you can help. The United States, you can help negotiate this, and that's where this dialogue has been mentioned. Of course, there is no mechanism for this. There's no agreement, and the world, again, I think, will push back on this idea. So we're in this tense time for the next few weeks.
Justin Crump, thank you very much. Dr. Sarah Phillips is a British orthopaedic surgeon. She's travelled to Gaza over 20 times over the past decade and recently returned from a fortnight working at the European Gaza Hospital in Khan Yunis. I spoke to her this morning and asked her to describe what she saw at the Rafah crossing through which she entered into Gaza.
Basically, Rafah is absolutely rammed. I mean, it is packed. You can hardly move. The vehicles go very slowly, and there are refugee camps, tents, right up to almost the fence. You cannot move. The other impression was certainly going in, there were these groups of adolescent kids, really, And we had to have 2 kids riding shotgun on our vehicle to make sure that we weren't attacked. And it's interesting because there was something that came through on the emergency medical team WhatsApp basically saying that another EMT last week had been attacked by these groups of youths. And we weren't, because we'd paid for these to ride shotgun. But, you know, lasting memory was of this kid just sitting in the dirt, quite in front of the car, with the stone in his hand waiting it to throw. And that's just, you know, that sort of desperation, that starvation, that's trying to stop any vehicle that might have something in that might be of use to them.
The normal rules of society have broken down.
Yeah, because there is no food. There's not enough food, water, or anything to go round. You're warned not to hand food out to people because you will get a riot.
So you were there, what, nearly 2 weeks, and that whole time
Yeah.
you were in the European Gaza Hospital in Khan Yunis?
Yes, yeah.
And what
we didn't move out at all.
And so a typical day is spent how?
So mainly the team were operating. I was going out onto the wards to try and see patients, but that was quite difficult because the hospital itself is completely packed. You know, this is a hospital that I've been visiting for almost 10 years. Now, I get quite disorientated in buildings at the best of times, but was undoubtedly completely disorientated because there were patients sleeping and relatives sleeping in the corridors. The grounds outside were full of tents.
The sort of work that you're doing, when you talk about you've got 2 plastic surgeons operating the whole time, what sort of things are they doing?
The main injuries in any sort of conflict or any type of catastrophe are often orthopedics combined with plastic. So you're talking about often the limb injuries, arms and legs, big open fractures, soft tissue loss, bone loss, and infection. A lot of debris gets blown into or taken into the wounds, and then it's difficult to clear.
Did you feel, were there moments when you thought, I can't deal with this is just too much?
The injuries themselves are, are quite awful, and they are the worst you'll ever see. But I've seen, because I've been going to Gaza for so long, and because we saw the outcomes of the 2014 war, we've dealt with these before. I think the difficulty here is the huge numbers. I think my concern in the long term is that there will be so many patients that require treatment, and they will always be disabled.
I mean, the effect of this for years and decades to come.
Yeah, it'll be decades.
And the Nasser hospital, the reason Nasser hospital was targeted is that the IDF, Israel, says it has evidence of it being used to hold hostages and of Hamas using it. Can you imagine that being possible?
I have no idea.
You never saw any evidence that these hospitals could have been used as a sort of command and control structure by Hamas?
No.
Did you see any construction in Egypt, on the Egyptian side of the border? We're hearing drones reporting that there's a sort of compound, a walled compound that's been built.
No, we didn't see anything of that. My memories of travelling through the Sinai and getting to the Rafah crossing is a huge number. I mean, absolutely huge number of trucks waiting to get in. I mean, thousands, I'm sure. And some, we were told that some of the drivers have been there well over a month.
How do you feel about what might happen there now?
We have friends and colleagues whose families are displaced down at Rafah, and obviously a huge concern regarding our friends and colleagues and how they are, and whether they will come out of this safely.
What do they say to you about what they are hoping for or what they want?
Well, they obviously want a ceasefire.
And do they feel that all that could be done is being done?
I have to say we haven't really gone into much conversation with that. It's with our friends and colleagues. It's mainly supporting them as best we can. But often the conversations are too difficult and too upsetting for them.
Dr. Sarah Phillips talking to me. Now, since the first broadcast weather forecast in 1937, things have got a bit more accurate.
Here is the weather forecast for tomorrow. A disturbance to the southwest of the British Isles is moving southeast. Forecast for Scotland, local wintry showers, rather cold.
Well, they've got better since then, but they're about to get even better. Scientists will soon be able to make forecasts accurate enough to determine the weather a month in advance. Professor Liz Bentley is Chief Executive of the Royal Meteorological Society, and she explained to me what the new monthly predictions will be able to tell us.
What it won't be able to do is say in a month's time it's going to rain in London at 2 p.m, a little bit like we can get on those kind of day-to-day forecasts at the moment. We won't get that detail, but it will be able to tell us that we're going to have an unsettled period in a month's time, or it's going to be particularly dry and hot, and therefore we can plan for the kind of things we can do with that kind of detail. So it will certainly improve our long-range planning. But it won't give us the detail if you've got a particular event on a particular time in a location. You won't get that kind of detail weeks in advance.
But gosh, even with that detail, it has the potential to change our natural conversations because there'll be more predictability about the weather.
Absolutely, and for businesses and governments, there's an opportunity to do some proper planning. We have monthly forecasts at the moment, but the detail is quite lacking. It's fairly bland, doesn't give a huge amount of detail, and actually the accuracy isn't that great. So this will really be, a huge step change in our history, I guess, of weather forecasting.
But when you look back at the history of forecasting, we are so much better now, I suppose, that the forecasts are so much more accurate than they used to be.
Yeah, so let's go right back to the very beginning when weather forecasting became a science, and we have to go back to the 1850s. And probably there's a couple of people I think are worth mentioning who really revolutionised weather forecasting back then. So the first person was Francis Beaufort, and many people will be familiar with the Beaufort scale that gives a wind scale criteria. And then you had Robert Fitzroy. Both of them were actually naval officers and kind of well respected. Fitzroy went to work within government, so was chief of the Board of Trade, which is what we call the Met Office. There was an event in 1859, the Royal Charter sank during a great storm in October 1859, there was lots of loss of life, and Fitzroy developed charts and a way of using those charts to try and predict the weather, just a few hours ahead though in those days.
Since then, it's just gradually more information, more science, more accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And events have happened since then that have really had to change things, like the Great East Coast Storm in 1953, great loss of life across the UK and in the Netherlands.
Well, the map of eastern England at this moment has been changed. Beneath rows of houses, 2 4 homes are rock.